Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to be building a simple application which will do the same thing as the previous application, except we're going to be building it without generating the code. The reason why you should know how to configure entity framework and identity framework into your application from scratch is because sometimes when you're working in teams or when you're tired, you might change something and it'll break. By knowing how things are put together, rather than always relying on auto generation, you'll be able to fix these things when they do occur, or modify them in the case that you want to do something unique to your code to make it operate in a different way. So yeah, let's get started. Okay, so let's start up Visual Studios 2019. Create a new project. Select ASP.NET Core Web Application. Click Next. And then we will call the application from scratch app. Create it. Make sure web application model view controller is what is being created, and the framework version of ASP.NET Core is set to 3.1. Also make sure that authentication is set to no authentication since we're setting up identity framework from scratch, and then click Create. Visual Studios will create our project. And here we are. We have the base template project, like before. If we press play on Visual Studios and open it up in the browser, we will see that we have the template page without the login and registration on the right. Furthermore, we still do have the home and privacy pages, as well as the default message, welcome, learn about building web apps with ASP.NET Core. Okay, so let's stop that. Go to our project in Solution Explorer, right click, and go to Manage NuGet Packages. What NuGet Packages, that NuGet Package Manager allows us to do is see all the additional libraries we can add to our project. Microsoft has made it very easy to do this and catalogs them all. So by selecting them from this browse list in NuGet Manager, it'll automatically download and install in your application. So the first package we need to install, since we're currently setting up Entity Framework, is Entity Framework Core. There are two versions of Entity Framework and Entity Framework Core. Entity Framework was for the .NET versions of works with .NET. However, we're using .NET Core, so Entity Framework Core is a lightweight rebuild of Entity Framework. So we'll install that first. So click on it, and then click Install. Accept the license agreement, and once it's installed, you'll see the installed version and an option to uninstall. So that's good. The next thing we have to install is Entity Framework Core Tools. So type that in the browser search box, and then click Microsoft Entity Framework Core .tools. On a side note, the version tends to be important when you're installing packages, because from version to version, they tend to change exactly some of the actual commands and stuff. Not always, but more often than not. So now let's install Entity Framework Core Tools. What Entity Framework Core Tools does is allow us to control Entity Framework from the Package Manager console. So we can enter in the commands there. Click I accept on the license agreement, and it will install. And you could see the installation occurring in your output window. It is installed. So, okay. So the first thing we're going to do is go to our app settings.json file because we still need to configure it, correct? So we're going to add our connection string to our database. So type in connection strings with S, double colon, curly brackets, and then default followed by a close double quotes. So now we have to find our connection string to our database. So let's go to Server Explorer. I mean SQL Server Object Explorer. They look the same, but they're not. And then click on SQL Server. And we will add, and then we'll see SQL Server right here. Right click and click Add SQL Server. Then if you do have SQL Server installed, you would type in the actual name of the server, or you can browse it from your local network if you have it installed locally. If it's installed on another computer, you would have to connect to it over the network. Since I'm on a network, but there are no other SQL Server instances that are visible to my computer, it says no connections to explain. And if you have Azure connection set up, you would be able to import that connection, those server connections in your Azure thing, in your Azure toggle. But we have a local instance, and that is SQL Express. So click that, and then click Connect. What will happen here under SQL Server is that you will actually see it pop up. I already had it installed, but chances are, if you have never added it before to Visual Studios, it's not there. So this is my install, and I'm going to add a database by clicking on the database folder within my SQL Server Express instance in the SQL Server Object Explorer, and click Add New Database. I'm going to call that database from scratch app.db and press Enter. Next, I'll click on the instance, right-click, go to Properties, and look at the Properties window, which is under Solution Explorer on the right of your screen or wherever you might have set it up. Go to the top, and we'll see here something called connection string. Copy it, Control-C, and then paste it in your default connection string. And that's our connection string. However, something's missing. We need to specify the database it connects to by default. So after data source, semicolon, type in database equals from scratch app.db, and then semicolon. And that is our default connection string for connecting to the database for our application. And it'll connect to the database in SQL Server Express because we told it to. Next, go to Startup. Because just adding it to the app settings.json file is not enough. We actually have to set it up in the startup.cs so that the Visual Studios program knows that it should actually use that connection string specified in the app settings.json file. Okay, so now we're going to be adding Entity Framework Core's configurations to the startup.cs file. What I like to do is look at my older projects to pull the code because I don't always remember the things I don't do often off the top of my head, and most people don't. You might remember it has to be done, but you're not going to remember the exact syntax all the time unless you have a good memory, which I don't. So go to startup.cs, and I will go down, and this is the segment of code we need. So what this specifies is that for our application, it will be using SQL Server, and it's going to get the configuration strings from the get configuration strings default connection setting. So take that and paste it here. However, something is wrong with this statement because we have the squiggly lines, right? So the first thing that's missing is that we need an application DB context file, which was automatically generated for us before, but isn't now. So create a new folder in the project and call it data. Next, create a new class and call it application DB context. Press enter. Next, what we need to do is make application DB context inherit from DB context. Then press Control period after the squiggly line, and it'll import Entity Framework Core. Then save it, go back to Startup, and after Application DB Context, click Using From Scratch App.data. If you recall, Application DB Context is where we specify what classes are models and to generate as tables in our database. Okay, so let's go to startup.cs and we're going to see a squiggly line under Use SQL Server. So I know what this issue is, but if you didn't, you would type into Explorer asking why this is showing up. But basically we're missing a package, which I forgot to install. So we'll go to Browse, we'll type in SQL Server, enter. As you can see, there's a library that we need to include in order to use SQL Server with Entity Framework Core. So let's install that. I accept. And output manager will show DB Context Options Builder does not contain a definition for SQL Server. So it's installed, and it's just reiterating the issue we have over here in our error list. So press Control period, and suddenly we have the option to use Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Include that. So we press Enter and include it, and suddenly the squiggly line went away. The usings at the top of the C# file are basically a list of all the libraries included that are whose functionality is accessible in this file. Okay. However, this connection string looks a little bit funny. I don't remember seeing a default connection in my app settings.json. That's because we called it default instead of default connection. So if we go back to startup and change this to default, then it will pull from the correct configuration. Note how configuration.getConnectionString automatically looks for the connection strings attribute. That's a default setting. If you want to access different variables or different attributes in this file, you would have to use a different format. But for connection strings, it automatically looks there. We'll get to that later. Okay, so now we have our getConnection string. And if we look at our application DB context, we're missing something. Basically, what we're missing is the default constructor that tells us to, call the DB context constructor. So let's go to the segment of code over here and see what was done in our application DB context in my old file, because I don't usually set this up, so I don't remember. Since Visual Studios would auto-generate this for us. So here's the application DB context constructor, which is basically the first segment of code to run whenever our class is created. So this will run by default. So if we create an object from this class, the constructors are automatically called, which you probably know, but I'm just saying it for the sake of reiterating it, since you would have learned that in the Introduction to Programming class. Okay, so we added our constructor, and we have our database set up. and we have the connection string set up pointing to the proper database. So now what's left to do is create a model. Let's create a model and call it notes and press enter. And we're going to give notes the following attributes: ID, title, and description. All right. Now let's go back to data and add this class to our database context. And we will call this notes. Actually, let's change the name of model to note. Okay, that's been changed. Then we'll call db set of note. So note how, and then we have to import the notes file so that we can access this. So note how we call it a db set, because it's a set of data, set of objects of notes. So we'll receive a list here, and it'll be called notes. So now we can access this whenever we want to in our program. So now we have to create that table in our database. So in order to do that, we'd have to go to Package Manager Console, type in add migration, note. Then click enter, and Visual and Entity Framework Tools will automatically call Entity Framework Core in order to generate the migration file, which will create the tables in our database. As you can see here, now we have a table that will be able to contain the data for the notes, that has the form of notes, and we have a protected override up function, which basically creates the table. This code creates the table in our database, and below we have a down. So this would, if we were to remove this migration, using remove migration, this segment of code would run on our database, and it would remove the table. So now let's type in update database to commit these changes to our database and press enter. What Entity Framework Core has done is now created in our database. So if we go to SQL Server Object Explorer, go to our from scratch app database and look at the tables, suddenly we have notes. But look over here, we also have the EF migrations history, which tells us which migrations have been run on our database. So if we view the data, we will see that we have a migration ID as well as, and its name of this record is 20191220. If we look here at the file name 20191220, it's the same, and it also tells us the version of the framework that was used. It versions it automatically. So, okay. So that's great. Entity Framework does a lot of work for us that our DevOps team would usually have done, which reduces the workload on our side since it's all automatically generated. Okay. So now we have our table. Now we have our data. Now we have to create the controller that will be, that would usually have been auto-created for us if we used the Visual Studio's functionality to create, edit, delete, and view the details of our notes data. So go to Controllers, right-click, go to Add New Controller, and add a MVC controller that is empty. and then press add. We will call this controller notes controller, and then it will be created. So Visual Studios right now is just creating a controller for us and generating an empty file or empty controller. So see, it automatically inherits from controller, which has base classes to specify that this is a controller, and creates for us our default method, which is called index. So now we have to create the views. So go to views and create a folder called notes. Because by default, the way the actual code is tied together is that the notes controller, the first part of the controller's name, refers to a folder over here. The first part of the class's name, I mean. Notes will automatically direct you to the notes folder under views. And we'll add a file, which is a view, and we'll call it index. Because, based on our router, in our startup.cs, if we go all the way to the bottom, we'll see use endpoints, and it automatically configures our URL pattern in the browser to have the first part of the URL refer to the controller, the second part to the action, which is basically the method, and the third part would automatically be considered the ID variable if we had one being passed into our action or method. Note the question mark afterwards. That indicates that it is optional. Okay, so now we're back in our notes controller, and we have created a file called index. So let's see it in action.